Well, good afternoon. What a pleasure to see you all here to help me welcome Anne, who has written an absolutely wonderful book, Les Parisiennes. And I just want to thank you very much for being with us. And we've had a real opportunity in the last couple of days to be looking at World War II from all dimensions. But one of the things I love about your story is that you have focused on where it really happened. I mean, among the local populations. Of course, we know the military strategy and how the military story unfolds, but not nearly enough is known about the conditions for people who were trying to go on about life, hold down a job, survive under a really very difficult set of circumstances. So let's start with, I have a question for you about how you got the idea to write this book, because in a lot of ways, one might have thought that it would have been written long ago, but in fact it wasn't. So what was your source of inspiration for this?
It really was how I told it yesterday, and I don't know if any of you heard my talk yesterday, so I'll tell it in a slightly different way, but it's absolutely what happened. So I finished a book on Wallis Simpson called That Woman, and I was in Paris with...
Great title, by the way, don't you think?
Right behind
Oh my gosh,
so
there
it is. So it is. Well, I didn't
That's
arrange
great.
that, I promise you. So my publisher was saying to me, well, what are you going to do next? You know, we'd like more of That Woman. And I said, no, one book about Wallis is enough. And I didn't see myself as a royal historian, and I really didn't want to write another book about the royal family. But I had this rather bizarre invitation to Van Cleef & Arpels. And I won't tell that story now, but I had not spent any time with Van Cleef & Arpels before my book, and it was a complete eye-opener to go to their workshop and showroom and to see how these jewels had been made and how they had been constant rivals of Cartier. And I really hadn't focused on that, but it was an extraordinary story to learn about how Rachel Van Cleef had held the company together and then committed suicide in 1942. And I'd gone from Van Cleef & Arpels to the Memorial De La Shoah, which is the Holocaust Museum in Paris, it was one of the last Holocaust museums to open in Europe. And if any of you haven't been there, I really urge you to go. They have this extraordinary collage of photographs of the people who haven't survived. They've gathered together this wall of photographs, and outside there's a wall of names of people who didn't survive. And there I found, in various forms, engraved on this wall, Anna Rubinstein, Hannah Rubinstein, Rubinstein spelt with an E and an I, Anne Rubinstein, and my maiden name was Rubinstein. So there was my name engraved on this wall of people who hadn't survived in Paris. And I thought to myself, what if my ancestors hadn't gone to London, if they'd ended up in Paris from Lithuania? And I came back and I was talking to my publisher about this extraordinary day I'd had in Paris, going from the highlight, the jewel of Paris, literally the jewels, to the Holocaust Museum. And as we talked about it, we realized that it was extraordinary, the light and the dark, that, what Paris was, the city of light, this epithet that it was always called because of the theatre, the cinema, the couture houses, the beautiful buildings, all these things that gave Paris its name, and the darkness, the people who hadn't survived, les années noires, as these 4 years were called, and the fact that the couture houses and the cinema and the theatre survived during this period was so extraordinary and such a contrast. And as I started to explore that, I looked at the many different options for women and the fact that the survival of the couture houses was absolutely necessary to the economic survival. And, suddenly it became clear that actually some women had a choice, but not many. and I think the women who didn't have a choice were the prostitutes and the actors and the singers. And I realized that there was a sort of one-dimensional view in England that many women who fought in England and America believed that French women, oh, they all collaborated, didn't they? They slept with Germans. Well, yes, some of them did, but they had to. And I realized that actually this was a book because people hadn't looked at the huge possibilities of choice, and that some women, of course, had no choice at all. And I didn't know how I would shape that into a book, but I realized I felt it was a book that had to be written, this enormous contrast and possibility for women. So that was how it arose.
Yeah, well, Anne, I think that comes through very loud and clear, a lot of these moral choices. And part of the reason I found it fascinating myself is having spent so many years traveling to the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. I mean, it's very easy to say, oh, well, if I had lived in the Soviet Union, for instance, I would have stood up to, you know, Joseph Stalin, or I would have stood up to Leonid Brezhnev or something. But I'm sure the Nazis had the same approach here, is that whenever they could, they made sure that they were going to punish the families too.
Yeah.
So some of the choices that were being made here were by women were presumably about families as well.
I think this is absolutely, you've gone to the nub of the problem. And almost the first talk I gave, somebody brightly at the back of the audience, any questions? Yes. What would you have done? Would you have slept with a German? So, you know, on the spot, I realized that I said, I guess I would if I had a child, you know. And so I've already said that. It's on record. But, you know, so you can't ask me that and shame me. I was caught out very early on. But as I thought about it, I guess, you know, had I been young and childless, I'm sure I would have joined the resistance. Of course you would. That's what you'd have done. But had I been older and had elderly parents or young children, it becomes a much more complex choice, and I don't really know what I'd have done. I like to think I'd have joined the resistance and fought. But yes, so you ask about reprisals, and that, I think, is the really complex issue that let's have some dates in here. Up until 1941, when there was the Nazi-Soviet pact, the communists, who were the young firebrands, really had their hands tied behind their backs, and they couldn't resist. And the reprisals were so shocking. Whole villages, you know, there were ad hoc attacks where young firebrands would shoot a German, thinking this was what they had to do, and then sort of 60 men would be lined up against a wall, or your family would be taken. So really none of the great powers wanted people to resist in the early stages. After 1941, when Hitler marched into Russia, the communists were released really at that point. And again, there were occasional attacks, but nobody wanted, when I say nobody, the officials didn't want these ad hoc attacks because of the reprisals until the Allies were ready, and nobody quite knew when that would be. Would it be 1942, 1943, and eventually it was not until 1944 that they were ready. So actually, although Churchill sent a few women into Paris, the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, and in Paris they had to be women, and there were 39 of these women, and most of them met fairly gruesome deaths, but they needed to bolster the resistance, and I think that it's important to look at these dates, at the phases of when it was possible to resist, and what could you do until that time? Well, there were various possibilities. You could bolster the resistance by delivering these political tracts, as they were called, the leaflets that were saying, you know, the Allies will eventually invade, so until that time, can you perhaps shelter down Damen, shelter Jews, shelter resistors on the run? Can you build up some kind of arms? And many of the women felt that that was a useful thing to do, to hide pistols, to start, you know, gathering a sort of armory to deliver weapons, to deliver money. I mean, the resistance was always short of money, so that was something that they could do. There were various things that stopped short of actually shooting a German, because that was just, inviting these appalling reprisals. So,
What was likely to happen to you if you got caught sheltering a Jew or helping a Jew transfer to
you'd be taken to Avenue Foch, and certainly if you delivered political leaflets, you'd be tortured until you gave away the name of where the printing press was. The very first resistance group, which was associated to the Musée de l'Homme, I mean, they were all picked up, all put in Fresnes or Cherche Midi, various prisons where it was almost impossible to escape. And the men were all taken to Mont Valérien and shot, and the women were shipped out to Ravensbrück. So, the Germans, you would have thought, were so busy prosecuting the war that they wouldn't, you'd have thought, they wouldn't actually be worried about, sheltering a Jew. But at some point, and it was mostly after 1942, when the final solution became part of their war aims, that sheltering a Jew was something that you would be picked up and taken to prison for.
I think it's also, maybe you could describe too, the kind of material existence that most people had, and then we're going to talk about the great and shining examples and individuals that we all know about, like Coco Chanel and others. But for ordinary people,
the shortage of food was extraordinary. People would send young children to bicycle for a whole day into the country, perhaps to come back with a cabbage or a cauliflower. I mean, life in Paris was really the grey market I talk about. In fact, much of my book is about the grey life, because it usually wasn't so clear-cut of black or white. I mean, there were people who lived off the black market, and Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir, of course, had access to food. So I think you would talk about that as the black market, but mostly it's this grey in between that isn't clear-cut. But how do you manage to live? Do you steal ration coupons? Do you get up early and try and go out to the country and come back with a suitcase of food that you've suddenly rediscovered country cousins that you'd forgotten existed, because there was a desperate need for food, and lots of the children suffered. Rickets is the obvious illness, but many illnesses where they actually just didn't have enough money for food. And there are stories of children being sent out, and I'm not just talking of Jewish children, that was another problem, but the children who would be sent to boarding schools in the country, and perhaps the parents would send them food parcels, and occasionally, not always, but occasionally, the teachers decided actually to keep the food parcels for themselves, that, they needed it more. You never knew quite, if your children would get the food, and if you decided to send your children out to escape with a passeur or a passeuse, these were the people who escorted children to another country. Sometimes you could trust the passeur, but sometimes they would sell on the children to the Nazis, and they'd make money that way. So, nothing was completely safe or completely clear-cut. And there are stories of concierges, and sometimes the concierge was completely honest and would warn the family, I've heard there's a roundup, I think you should move on. And sometimes the concierges would take advantage of the roundup and go into the flat and steal the silver. And many families who came back after the war found their flats, and not only Jewish families, but that's where it was most evident. They would come back after the war and find that their flat had been completely cleared out. So, I mean, your question is, what was daily living like? There were shortages of food, and that was the most dramatic. But for those who had money, there were possibilities of buying couture clothes. And it's that contrast that has struck me as so extraordinary. You know, how could people have the money to buy expensive couture clothes? Well, the people who had the money were the French Gestapo, most of all. By French Gestapo, I mean the French supporters of Vichy, the French Nazis. And they were often the film stars and the film stars' wives, but they weren't always. You know, there were petty officials who had money, and you saw that it was very clear because they were dressed in fine clothes. And, you know, just to go back to Van Cleef and Arpels at the beginning, because they were so keen for me to cover their story, they were very kind to me, and they gave me the file cards of all the jewelry that was bought and sold during the war.
My goodness
So
me.
from that I could see that often it was Germans who were buying little trinkets to send to their wives, daughters, mistresses. You know, I couldn't tell who they were back home. And those were often the trinkets, you know, really small pieces. But there were big statement pieces of jewelry that were being made during the war. And it wasn't only Van Cleef and Cartier. There was Boucheron, there was a woman called Suzanne Belperron. I mean, there were many jewelers who were continuing during the war. And of course they were selling to Germans, but there were also French families who, it has to be said, some of them were selling jewelry because they needed to convert the jewelry into currency, and some of them were buying jewelry. So, you know, that was rather extraordinary to imagine that that was going on during the war. And I began very judgmentally, because in England, you know, women during war believed it was their duty to wear khaki and look dowdy. You know, that's what we did in England. And many women were in uniform, but those who weren't would think it was extraordinary to buy jewelry during war. But, you know, this was, I learnt as I went on with my research that being judgmental, really, there was no point to it, because actually keeping the economy going was terribly important. And so buying and selling jewelry had various values. It was partly because it was important to keep up one's spirit. It was also that it was a currency. So, for example, one of the stories I didn't tell yesterday was about Odette Fabius. So before the war, Odette Fabius had actually been very friendly with René Van Cleef, or René Puissant. And when she went down to Marseille, the resistance really needed cash to buy weapons, to feed their people, many of whom were no longer living at home. So Odette was asked by the man she was having an affair with, Ferry Pisani, to go to Vichy to find René, and she took a diamond that he'd got hold of somehow, no doubt stolen. I mean, he certainly had mafioso connections. And she took this diamond, and René gave her far more money than the diamond was worth. And it was after that that René threw herself out of the window and committed suicide. And some people think that, you know, she felt, I've done all I can do. I've converted this diamond into cash for the resistance, probably her most noble deed. What else can I do? And after that, I think the reason she threw herself out of the window and killed herself was because the compulsory wearing of the yellow star had been introduced, and she knew that she couldn't hide the fact that she was Jewish and they'd come after her. And once you wore a yellow star, you were an easy target, and you were picked up and you were sent to the camp. So I think she thought, you know, I've done the best I can do. I've given the resistance money for jewels, and there's no more I can do. So, you know, sometimes it was very black and white, and sometimes it was just so murky and grey.
You know, I wondered in reading your book whether some of this effort to remain very stylish, even for ordinary people. You write about trousers were not
Yes.
allowed, and so people were expected to wear nylon stockings, but those weren't available, and the amount of trouble they went to divert resources for not only sort of complying with the law, but also looking smart, as the British would say, which means well-dressed and the rest of it. Was that a chic? Yes. Was that a kind of a form of rebellion in a way? Do you think it was?
Yes, I mean, unquestionably, there were precise forms of rebellion. Some people went to the effort of making poshery buttons in a tricolor, or wearing, red, white, and blue, or the Cross of Lorraine as their jewel. Bizarre. I mean, Cartier even created a gold brooch that was when the compulsory wearing of the yellow star was introduced. One woman who was not Jewish thought that this was a form of rebellion to have a gold brooch as big as she could afford in the shape of a yellow star. I mean, it's a bizarre form of rebellion. But and big hats that sometimes had vegetables on them that obviously were drawing attention to themselves. I mean, it's not really rebellion, but it's saying, I'm going to be outrageous. I'm going to do something that draws attention to myself. I'm not going to sort of fold in and be obedient. It's not like laying gelignite on railway lines, let's be honest about it. But it was, in some ways, all they could do. And while we're talking about laying gelignite on railway lines, I mean, I think what women did in many ways was sheltering downed airmen, escorting them to safe houses, delivering tract, trying to keep businesses going, perhaps, turning the Gothic road signs the wrong way. Many ways of disrupting the comfortable German existence. There were other smaller ways, but what they often couldn't do was actually get access to weapons or formally join a resistance group. This was people talk about the resistance. What many of them don't understand is that there were hundreds of diverse groups, and actually to be part of one involved a formal leaving of your family, abandoning your elderly parents, and only then could you then be given a weapon. And because de Gaulle, after the war, chose to reward people who had actually been in combat, or combattant is a key French word, very few women actually were formally recognized.
Right.
So, what I've tried to do is show all the myriad ways that women refused to allow the German boot to be put on them. And that's really just, it wasn't always killing a German or laying gelignite on railway lines. They just weren't prepared to toe the line. And I just felt that these women deserved to be recognized because they weren't actually collaborating. And, we come down to what would I have done? What would you have done? What was available? And I think the choices weren't always stark. They were often just much murkier as to surviving.
Yeah, I'm sure the numbers are murky too. I'm sort of interested in Nazi behavior, German and Nazi behavior. I'm separating them out a little bit.
Yes.
In terms of brutality to local French population, we'll put the Jews aside for a second.
Yeah.
I know in Normandy, I travel there a lot, and actually the Normans have rather good memories of the Germans. I mean, we're out in an agricultural area. They did not send the A-team to Normandy. The Germans didn't, so you had a lot of people who didn't really want to be there. I mean, I'm talking about the Germans. But they did pay cash for agricultural products.
Exactly.
From the French. So describe for this group a little bit, what kind of conditions were they? I mean, were Germans there was there a high incidence of rape and real brutality on that level?
No,
you certainly.
I think later on there was. I think right at the end of the war we're talking about rape, but the British and American soldiers when
Well,
they
that's true. That is true.
don't have an unblemished record for all of that.
Right.
No, I mean, a lot of the Germans in Normandy were billeted on families,
Right.
and they were cultivated and civilized men who didn't want to be doing the job they had to do. And, it was very easy. You see that in Suite Française. I think Nemirovsky describes it extremely well. And, it was very easy for local populations to decide, look, there's not going to be liberation for 2 or 3 years. We have to get along with this.
Yes, right.
It's attentiste. And, the figure is between 200 and 300,000 Franco-German babies. So there was collaboration. I actually prefer the word collusion. I think collaboration is a harsh word. And for many of the French, the survival was what mattered.
Right.
And was, without Frenchmen around, most women do what is required of them. And sometimes it was brutal, but not always.
Not always, yes.
So,
Well, that's right. And so the book has all of these wonderful figures, some of whom we've really heard a lot about. I mean, in post-war period, like Chanel,
Yes.
Coco Chanel. And you mentioned a couple already, but now she didn't look like she was really suffering during the war.
Well,
and what is the story on that one?
Chanel was approaching 60, not that old when
No,
war
not
broke
that
out.
old at all.
But she decided, exactly,
A young one.
Well, I find it really funny. A lot of the books say, well, Chanel was old by the time the war
excuse me.
broke out. So, she knew her day was over. She
Oh.
absolutely did not think her day was over, and she wasn't old, but she was approaching 60. So she had this very young, handsome lover that she moved into the Ritz with, von Dinklager, and he'd actually divorced somebody in order to move into Paris.
This is a German officer?
Yes, a German officer who divorced a woman because of the racial laws. She discovered that she was actually half Jewish, so that wasn't going to work out at all. So, Chanel had a comfortable war. She didn't have to work. She gave up her shop. I think the reason that I find her behavior offensive is not that she closed her shop down, not that she moved into the Ritz and had a younger German lover. It's the way she behaved when she realized that her perfume suddenly was worth a huge amount of money, and she'd sold a stake in it very early on because she needed the money in order to expand, and she sold a stake in it to the Wertheimer brothers. And as you may guess from the name, the Wertheimer brothers were Jewish. So come the war, she thought, well, that was a bit stupid of me, wasn't it? They were the bourgeois, as in, Bourjois. It still exists. So during the war, she thought, well, they're Jewish. So, they shouldn't be allowed to own this stake. Now's my chance. I'm going to reclaim this stake in my perfume business, and then I'll be really wealthy. So she fought them, but actually they were one step ahead of her. They'd already Aryanized the company, so she couldn't actually legally get what she wanted. But her lawyer, who was married to Laval's daughter, José Laval, so he was trying to help her reclaim. And in the end, they actually decided, even though they didn't have to, it was easier to give her what she wanted. So, she was extremely wealthy because anything for a quiet life. But I just think it was so low to try and reclaim something that she had no right to. And I think she was very lucky after the war. She really should have been picked up for collaboration horizontale, but Churchill stepped in. And
Isn't that a great line? I love that. Churchill stepped in.
Well, I think he was the one who decided that actually, he didn't want... he knew her because pre-war she'd had this long-standing affair with the Duke of Westminster, And she just quietly went off to Switzerland, and she didn't make a big noise. She was very annoyed because she thought, everything I've done to create comfortable clothes for women without corsets, and now, Christian Dior's creating this new look which involved corsets, and everything that I've done is being swept aside. So she was very anti-Dior, of course, but she survived. I think she was very lucky.
Well, I'd like to offer the last of my questions, and then if we have any time left over, I'm sure you've got some there in the audience. But gosh, when you look at all these stories from young girls in the French resistance who are jeopardizing their lives for sure,
Yeah.
to try and help the war effort and actually to help other human beings. And then you look at Coco Chanel's behavior, and then you have some wonderful examples of people who are in murkier territory there, I mean, from a moral standpoint. Though we are not moralizing, I get that. But do you ever have moments where you feel like there's got to be some kind of hierarchy of morality, or do you think it's just too hard at the end of the day?
Yeah, I
I
don't
know,
think
what
I'd
a
go
terrible
in. I think
question,
that I think I can't choose. I mean, I have so many favorite heroines. It depends which day you ask me, from Simone Weil to unknowns. I really do believe that unknown people are often more interesting than the really big names. So who would I pick? I would pick someone like a woman called Arlette Testiller. If any of you have seen Sarah's Key, the film.
Oh my gosh.
Okay,
yes.
well,
Wow.
she was the stand-in for Sarah, and this woman, a survivor of the Veldiv. She and her sister and her mother had been taken to the Veldiv, and they were on a train when her mother persuaded the two girls to jump from a moving train, and they walked back into Paris and survived. And I've met her, she's in her 80s, the most elegant, chic Parisienne you could possibly meet. And she now goes into schools talking about tolerance and what happened. And I mean, the enormous sadness of that story is that the mother, who did everything to help her two kids survive after the war, when she discovered that her husband hadn't survived, Abraham, they'd been childhood sweethearts in Poland. When he hadn't survived, she committed suicide. Having done everything to help her daughters survive during the war, post-war, she just couldn't live. She felt too guilty. I mean, she comes quite high on my list. There's a woman in Versailles called Jacqueline Fleury, who's also still alive in her 90s, and her whole family was involved in the resistance. And I think one of the really most difficult things I found writing this book was to try and understand fear, visceral fear in the pit of your stomach. I was born in 1952 and, grown up in peace and plenty, a baby boomer, and what fear have I had? We've been living in peace. And this woman described to me how she'd walk back to Versailles, and if any of you know Versailles, it still has cobbled streets. And she said you would hear the clack of the Nazi boots on the cobbled streets. And they got cleverer and cleverer with their radio vans and detecting wirelesses. And she said her own mother would house a wireless operator, and the whole family was involved in resisting. And she and her brother went off to try and steal the plans of the Atlantic Wall. And she described to me how, as a schoolgirl, she'd go into the metro, and you would know if there was going to be a Nazi at the foot of the stairs. She was delivering leaflets, and she said if you detected that there was going to be a Nazi roundup at the top of the stairs, you couldn't walk backwards, because that would really give away that you had something guilty. So you had to walk along sometimes 2 platforms to the next station. And, imagine, I've got kids, and, the thought of a 15-year-old with a rucksack full of leaflets, fearing a Nazi roundup, and walking along 2 stations so that you could eventually surface where there wouldn't be Nazis. I just wanted to know what it would be like to have that fear in the pit of your stomach. So here's what I did, which is so pathetic, and I've never told anybody, but I'm going to tell you, because I wanted to know. I couldn't go into a shop and do shoplifting. That would have been frightening, but I'm too middle class to do that. So if any of you have been on Eurostar, and you get there early, they don't let you go early. They make you sit till it's your train. So I had a ticket, but I was early, and I thought, well, how can I get on an earlier train? And so I sort of surreptitiously showed them that I had seat 12B or whatever it was, but it was 12B on the 5 o'clock train, and I was 12B on the 3 o'clock. And I thought, well, I'd just see what it was like. And they actually didn't spot that I'd shown them a wrong ticket. But then when I got on the train, I thought, well, I can't actually sit in 12B because there's someone else there. So I had to lock myself in the loo until the train took off. And then when the train took off, I didn't actually have a seat. So, and I really was scared, because I was scared that one of the Eurostar officials would come and check my ticket, and I'd never be allowed on Eurostar again. And, what I'm telling you is utterly pathetic, and I do realize, but I was trying to make myself feel fear, because I just, it's something in our generation.
We just don't know.
You just don't know what it's like to be fearful. So this woman went quite high up in my hierarchy of fear, because, she'd done the real thing. And there's one other woman. So this woman is still alive, also in her 90s. Wow. And she was married to an Englishman, so she spoke fluent English. She was French, but I loved her because she was easy to interview. I knew I'd never get anything wrong. Whatever she told me, I'd understand. We spoke half French, half English. And I got to know her really well, but she said she didn't want her name in my book because, now mostly when that happens, it's because they've collaborated. With this woman, she said, I don't want my name in your book because I haven't really done anything much. And she said, but I'll be good for you because I'll give you background, I'll check your facts. And I went to see her every time. She also gave me lunch quite often, so that was very nice. So I really loved this woman. And at the end, because she was 90, her daughter, who was my age, was coming over and helping her move into sheltered housing. She'd lived all her life in a fabulous flat in an area of, it was really wonderful, and she had to downsize. So as this 60-year-old daughter was moving her out, she found 3 things. She found in a box a Red Cross uniform, and she said to her mother, "Mais maman, tu n'as jamais dit que tu étais dans la Croix-Rouge?" And the daughter said, why haven't you told us? And the mother said, well, I trained in the Red Cross, but all I did, I went to the Veldiv, the Velodrome d'Hiver, where all the Jews were rounded up, and I handed them soup, and I couldn't do any more, so I don't want to talk about it. So what she was saying was she felt inadequate, that all she had done was hand out soup, and she knew perfectly well that the 14,000 Jews were going on to the death camps. But she had done something. The second thing we found were some typed letters from Canadian airmen that she had housed in her flat, and she'd never wanted to talk about it. Why? Because she didn't want to get her parents into trouble. She was living with her parents in the flat, so she'd never talked about it. But in the 1960s, these Canadian airmen wrote her letters thanking her for saving their lives and moving them on to another house. But she'd blanked this from her memory. So that was the second thing she'd done. And the third thing I found were these political tracts. It was called Témoignage chrétien, and she was a good Catholic, and her Jesuit priest had persuaded her to cycle to houses delivering these tracts saying that, there are things you can do, that God doesn't expect you to do nothing, and you'll be okay. And she'd cycled around her area of Paris and had delivered these leaflets. So 3 things she'd done, and yet she didn't want to be named in the book because, you know, she thought she hadn't done enough compared with real resistors. So, you know, in the hierarchy, I think she's probably up there.
I'll
You
say.
know, and just felt she'd done nothing. So I'm not going to select one, but there are lots.
There are lots. Well, you know, I guess we've got time for 2 questions, but I'm famous for bringing this to an end when it's time. So do we have 2 people who'd like to ask a question back there? Could you stand up, actually, so we can hear you, and then we'll try and repeat the question. Did you hear that?
Yes, yes. So the question was, what happened to the obvious collaborators after the war? Well, the easy pickups were all the performers, the singers, actors, dancers, because they had literally supported the regime. They were an easy prey, an easy target, and many of them were rounded up straight away. And there were these sort of citizens' tribunals because they didn't have enough judges and juries. But a lot of the women who it was known had been living with Germans were picked up and without any form of trial, they were subjected to summary justice, really. They were, there are pictures of how they would have a sort of photo hung around their neck. They would have their heads shaved. They'd be dragged around town, often naked, sometimes just in their underwear. They would have swastikas not actually tattooed, but inked on them, or sometimes on their forehead, and they'd be made to parade around town. And this was often summary justice. You know, it was just the men seeking revenge. And when I was staying in Tours, I mean, I do speak French, but my French was never good enough to have real conversations when people speak fast. So I've been having French lessons constantly while I was writing this book. And as my husband jokingly said, I was a bit too old to be an au pair, but that's really what I should have done. But I did an intensive course in Tours. Now, Tours was on the line of the division because it sort of followed the Loire around. And I had an interesting discussion with a man whose family had been taken on this sort of hated service travail obligatoire, the STO, where he'd been taken to Germany to work for the German factories. And he said that he knew his uncle had had an affair with a German woman while he'd been there, but the men could come back and just leave the German women behind, and nobody knew about it. So, you know, it was much easier for the men to have affairs with German women in Germany, and nobody knew, but for the French women on French soil who had affairs, everybody knew. So, you know, they really were punished, but there are lots of feminist gender studies because this was very definitely a gendered punishment.
I think.
I was reading a book called I can't think of it, it was about Italy after the war, during the war and then after the war, where the collaborators, the alleged collaborators were just simply shot, lined up, shot women. Did they do that in France?
So you want to repeat the question?
Yes, I was asked whether, well, it's beyond, as Tom Hanks famously said, it's beyond my pay grade to answer about Italy as well. But in France, yes. No, I mean, there were some, Robert Brasillac was shot. I mean, there were male collaborators who were shot. Some of the big political names, I mean, Pétain was saved, but Laval was killed. And there weren't many women who were shot, but mostly they were imprisoned. There was this new punishment called indignité nationale, which was a sort of being totally stripped of your citizenship and sent abroad, and your home was stolen. I mean, it was quite draconian, but there were certainly there were people who were shot as well.
Well, I just want to, if I may take a moment to just say in reflecting on these remarkable stories, this comes from my heart. I hope Americans don't feel powerless. I mean, we're living in a time where people are extremely upset on both sides, but we don't know anything about this kind of horror. And we have to be good to each other. We have to be good to each other, and we're going to be fine, but we have to be good to each other. I want to thank you, Anne, for an absolutely fabulous, fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah.